Hello everyone. I wanted to do a walkthrough with you for the worksheet. This is worksheet 3 for the semester project, and at this point in the project what I'm asking you to do is to fashion some simple research questions and hypotheses to get some practice with that experience. Someone asked me in an email earlier this week, do you want these questions and hypotheses to be based on the articles that we read? And my answer was, yes, ideally that's what I would like you to do. And I wanted to kind of model for you how I look at that process, because it is challenging. As I said in my email to y'all last night, reading research articles is hard. There's a lot of jargon and weird vocabulary. There's a lot of descriptions of statistical techniques that you haven't learned anything about yet. So they are challenging and difficult. So it's all a part of this learning process. And I just wanted to kind of walk you through how I do this process and kind of give you the logic behind the worksheet for this weekend. So let's say that I started, and remember back to week 1, or worksheet 1 rather, where I asked you to select a core variable and then identify 2 quantitative variables and 1 qualitative variable. Now on this worksheet, what I would recommend is that you stick to those variables. If you chose bonus variables and you feel like adding them, that's fine, but I'm only requiring you to do your core variable, the 2 quantitative variables, and the 1 categorical variable. I've given you some examples here on the worksheet of how to take a concept and then talk about that as a topic, restrict the topic, further narrow it, and then turn it into a research question. So if I was broadly interested in a concept like aggression, but more specifically I was interested in how people troll each other online, then I may even go more specific than that and focus on Twitter. And then I could ask a question: what's the impact of anonymity, like not having your name disclosed on your Twitter account? What's the effect of that on trolling on Twitter? Another example, I might be interested in pets in people's lives. I might be more specifically interested in pet therapy. Then go really narrow, dog therapy with college students, and finally fashioning it into a question: what's the impact of pet therapy on exam performance? So what you can see is you're moving from very, very broad interest in one variable to some restricted aspect of that variable to a very narrow topic, and then turning that into a question that can be assessed or evaluated with some sort of research technique. Now with the data set that you're working with, this would be the survey.save data set that's described in your Palette text. And remember, in the back of the Palette text, in the appendix where Palette describes for you this research that was done to generate the data sets that you're working with, there is a brief description of the study, and you should remind yourself of that. And then go back to your worksheet 1 and look at the variables that you selected. So for this demonstration, let's say that my core variable is life satisfaction, and then my first quant variable that I picked was optimism, my second quant variable that I picked was perceived stress, and my categorical variable that I selected was age. And I'm going to further define that as 3 groups. Now I need to do some restriction on these topics, and with this worksheet, I developed it as a grid, and I played with a bunch of designs, so this isn't perfect. Just use it for what it is. It's a way of getting you thinking about how to use variables and put them into questions. So if my primary interest is in understanding life satisfaction, and I'm specifically interested in the well-being aspect of life satisfaction, because well-being is only one component of overall life satisfaction. Then I might want to narrow that even further topically. And this is where your other variables start to come into play, since life satisfaction is my core variable. And I can, remind myself of that here. That's the thing I want to explain. So that's my primary outcome variable. And so I could start to really think about variables that predict well-being and life satisfaction. So then I could ask a broad question. It's still a fairly broad question at this point. What variables predict our level of life satisfaction or our overall state of well-being? So with my core variable, I'm going from, the very broad life satisfaction. I am specifically interested in well-being as a measure of life satisfaction, let's say. And then I'm interested in variables that predict these things, because it would be nice to know how they interact. And then I fashioned that as a question: what variables predict the level of well-being or life satisfaction? So that's when I have to shift over to my selected variables. And I've chosen two quantitative variables, optimism and perceived stress. Why am I interested in optimism? Maybe I've noticed that people who differ in their level of optimism, and that interests me. So making that observation that people do differ in how much optimism they have, that then makes me think, there might be some connection between optimism and well-being, because I may have observed that people that I know who tend to be optimistic, cups half full kind of people, tend to like their lives better. So I may go ahead and jump to the next narrowing, that I want to think about college students maybe. Or I could make that a little more broad and speak about it as in terms of adults. Since the database that you're working with is adults, it doesn't specify college students. Some were students, some were not. And then I could fashion it as a question. So much typing difficulty I'm having today. And I could do the same thing with perceived stress. Since, this is a variable that I've selected, why am I interested in perceived stress? People respond differently to stress, just like they differ in their level of optimism. Some people respond very intensely to stress. Some people respond with a lot of resiliency or grit. So there are lots of individual differences in perceived stress. I may want to then further narrow that and think about it in terms of a more trait-like approach. here I may be interested in adding some interrelationships between my variables. And that makes me think, maybe I need to put that up here too. So we're going to fashion this as a question. Now my third variable is a categorical variable about age. And an observation you may have made in your own life, do people who are younger, do they seem to differ in both their optimism and their response to stress? Do they differ in their sense of well-being? So I might be interested from a developmental standpoint about how people change might be interested in how people change over the course of their lifespan in my other variables of interest, my core variable and my two quant variables. I can narrow that in terms of how I want to specify differences in age. So making comparisons, the youngest group versus middle age versus, there's no good word for older. I'd be in that older group, I think. Maybe not. Depends on how you define it. And then I could ask a specific question. How do and that's how I get those questions. Now you can get a sense of where are we going to go in terms of making predictions, and that's the next step, is making predictions. So now I need to have some broad hypotheses and some very specific hypotheses. And it helps if you kind of take them one question at a time. When I ask this broad question, what variables predict the level of well-being and life satisfaction, I need to make some guesses about the variables that I've chosen, optimism, perceived stress, and age. So I could start with optimism and broadly say that with life satisfaction, I may also believe that perceived stress will be correlated with life satisfaction. And I may also predict that the three age groups So my first my first broad hypothesis, optimism will be related to correlated to life satisfaction. Perceived stress will be correlated with life satisfaction. And I could add some secondaries here in this space. That optimism and perceived stress might be related. And then my 3 age groups, since they are categorical, I'm going to compare those groups. So here I'm going to make the prediction that the age groups will differ in the 3 quantitative variables that I'm interested in. So those are broad hypotheses. Now what about specific hypotheses? So if I say optimism will be correlated with life satisfaction, this is where you need to go to your articles. So in some of the articles that I've found, optimism, and you might find this in some of the articles that you're looking at as well. The one that I found was by Gupta, where they were looking at well-being, stress, optimism, anxiety, depression, and they were comparing age groups as well, or rather Gupta was comparing age groups as well. And what Gupta found was that, in fact, optimism no, spelling is bad. So I make a very specific prediction. In this case, optimism will be positively correlated with life satisfaction or well-being. So the more optimistic people are, the higher their scores on well-being. In that same study, they also found that optimism was positively correlated, or negatively correlated rather, with perceived stress. So more optimistic people reported lower levels of stress and anxiety. So I can go ahead based on Gupta and make a specific prediction that optimism will be negatively correlated with perceived stress. Now, what about perceived stress and life satisfaction? I found a number of articles that were related to this, and one thing that was found, Extremera, I don't know how to pronounce that properly, and colleagues found that there was a connection between not only between optimism and life satisfaction, but also that optimism tend to buffer the connection between perceived stress and life satisfaction. So I could predict that, again, optimism would be negatively correlated with perceived stress. Perceived stress, I could predict, would be negatively correlated with life satisfaction. Now, at the same time, though, since optimism is negatively correlated with perceived stress, and I've had this article, Extremera predicts that when you have optimists, they tend to respond better to perceived stress. So if you're high in optimism, the relationship between perceived stress and life satisfaction will be weakened. Now, I'm not going to ask you to do that sophisticated a test, but that's one of the things that I see in my research articles. Now, what about age? I could fashion some specific predictions, and one of the studies that I looked at, they did compare age groups, and they found that in terms of life satisfaction, the middle groups, or the oldest individuals, tended to have the highest life satisfaction scores. So I'm going to predict that so I'm going to predict that the oldest of the three groups will have the highest life satisfaction. Then also, the one article that I found by Gupta found that for perceived stress and anxiety, they found that the people in the middle group reported the least anxiety and stress. So the middle-aged folks. Now that may be an artifact of being in a different cultural context, but you can use it to base your hypothesis. So those in the middle age group, at least based on what Gupta found, now right now this morning I didn't find a specific result about optimism, with the exception of one brief finding in the same Gupta article that the older age group tended to report the highest level of optimism as well. So I can go ahead and state that I predict the oldest group will have the highest level of optimism. And again, I'm basing that on the Gupta article. So you can see how when I'm working with making these predictions, I'm really tying myself to the specific variables that I've selected. And again, I recommend strongly that you take your core variable from worksheet 1, your first quantitative variable, your second quantitative variable, and then your categorical variable. Use those to do this worksheet. That's enough. If you chose bonus variables, they're called bonus for a reason. I would leave those out of this worksheet assignment and just stick to the main variables to focus on for your thinking here. And you can see how I tried to think broadly at first, narrow things down based on the description that Pallant has given us for what the study did, then work on asking some broad questions, and then how do I translate those questions into hypotheses? And remember that the difference between a research question and a hypothesis is a question is a question. A hypothesis is an actual prediction. The difference between the broad hypothesis and the specific is that I'm just saying things will be related or that groups will differ. I'm not specifying in what way. In a specific hypothesis, I am specifying in what way will they differ. So optimism positively correlated with life satisfaction, optimism negatively correlated with stress, perceived stress negatively correlated with well-being, and so on. So hopefully this helps, just to walk you through how I connect things to research articles and how I develop broad and specific hypotheses. As always, please contact me if you have questions. If you want to walk through your own variables with me, I am more than happy to help.